Last week, we covered how to use animation in child's play. So just to check in, were you able to use animation in your play with your child? How did your child respond when you exaggerated your play with them? Did they respond in any way? Did they play with you? Did they look at you? Did they communicate with you? Was it difficult to use animation in your play with your child? What were some of the challenges? We can talk more about these when we meet in person. So today we'll be covering what is communication, how to support communication development, and finally we'll end with the strategies on modeling and expanding language. So before we begin, we have a short narrative that talks about a mother and her son as they discuss some of the communication challenges they're facing with their child.
Samuel, a 4-year-old boy with developmental delays, is a handsome boy whose smiles and laughs bring his family great joy. He doesn't talk yet, but his mom and dad are always surprised by how great a communicator he is by using nonverbal actions, like taking his mom her purse when he is ready to leave their friend's house. He loves interactive games that involve adults or older children, like tag, hide and seek, and having his dad lift him into the air like an airplane. His favorite toys and activities are books that play music or say recorded phrases from children's movies, a tower that balls can roll through, and watching television. He is beginning to show interest in playing with other children at his preschool and his cousins who are about the same age. His mom and dad have noticed him standing near groups of children, playing and watching them, smiling and making sounds, but he doesn't ask to play. Sometimes he grabs a toy that another child is holding and runs off, but he doesn't seem to know how to play with the other children. From a very early age, his mother Veronica noticed some differences in the ways that he played with toys. He liked to stack blocks in a tower as high as they would go again and again, and enjoyed cause and effect toys that played music when he pressed a button. But he tended to press the same button again and again without looking at the pictures. At first, his mom wasn't sure how they could get Samuel to try out new toys and activities and to play with others. But with his therapist and teacher's help, she learned how to use his favorite toys and interests to motivate him to try out new toys and activities to use his favorite toys in new ways. She learned to get his attention by saying his name, show him new ways to use toys, and to praise his attempts to use toys in new ways. They also learned how to support Samuel to initiate play with other children by educating his friends on the ways that he communicated a desire to join in their activity. They taught him to say, "Play with me," using a picture symbol card with those words and an illustration that he handed to another child. His siblings and relatives now all know when he wants to play, and he knows how to join in on the fun. It took about 4 months of practice before Samuel used the card by himself, but his mom and dad think the time they spent teaching him is worth it because he is not left out of children's play at family events now. Also, now that he is older with the support of Veronica, her husband, and his siblings working with him at home, Samuel learns some new ways to play with his favorite toys, like stacking blocks to make a pretend house for his stuffed horse and pretending to have a birthday party with his siblings. Samuel has learned new ways to play, and Veronica knows that these play skills will help him to be more successful in playing with other children, because these are ways that other children play. She feels so happy when she thinks of the progress he has made and is looking forward to continuing to help him to learn to play with other children.
So based on this story, do you see any similarities between your child's communication and Samuel's? We see that Samuel had some difficulties communicating what he wanted or how he wanted to play, and even approaching other children his own age. So with different tools, they were able to provide some supports to Samuel so that he could communicate when he wanted to play and how to expand on some of his communication attempts. So when we think about communication, we can think about it in terms of different dimensions. So first we have receptive communication, and this is any communication that you can understand. For example, if someone makes a gesture at you, saying hi, or even understanding certain words or certain phrases that people tell you. Expressive communication is anything that you can produce, such as spoken language or even any gestures that you can use to indicate or communicate something to someone else. We can also think about it in terms of nonverbal communication. So these would be things like gestures like a thumbs up for good job, or even a wave for hello, or a wave for goodbye. We can also think about it in terms of verbal communication. So this is spoken language, and this is probably the most common perception of what communication is. But we can also think about communication as including all these different dimensions. So in your manual, you have a section, a page outlining the different stages of communication development. We begin with some of the very first gestures that people learn how to use. And these can include facial expressions, signs with your hands, pointing, showing, nodding, and other body movements, such as the examples shown here. This is some of the very first forms of communication that we'll see in very young children. Next, we have the stage of single words. So listed here are some of the most common single words that children will say or learn to say first. So for example, ball, dog, juice, more, no, and out. The next stage includes two-word phrases. So this is where children start adding another word to some of those single words they had learned in the previous stage. So big ball, eat cookie, go out, go potty, and more juice. The next stage of communication development is phrase speech. So this is where children start adding in verbs and objects to form abbreviated sentences, such as need to go potty, want to go outside, or go to sleep. And then finally, the last stage of communication development includes phrase speech with descriptors. So these include much more complex sentences that include specific adjectives to describe specific objects, such as I want more apple juice, mommy read the dog book, the blue car is mine. So based on these different stages of communication development, you can indicate which stages your child understands, so receptive language or receptive communication, and which of these is your child currently using. So which one are they expressing? Are they using gestures, single words, two-word phrases, phrase speech, or phrase speech with descriptors? So something else to notice is that your child may understand much more complex language or communication than they're able to actually use or express. So based on the stages, is your child's language communication the same for receptive and expressive? So do they understand and use the same type of language, or are they at different stages in communication? This will be important because in this chapter or session, we'll be covering how to model and expand on your child's communication development. So really starting from where your child is or which specific stage they're in, and then trying to move them forward to the next stage. So here are just some questions and things to consider. What is your child's language and communication like? Is their understanding and use of communication in the same or different stage? Which stage would you like for your child to be communicating in? To also better understand how your child is communicating their needs and wants, we have an activity that has a list of specific needs or wants that your child may be more likely to be engaged in at their current age. And then we also have a list of different ways that your child might be communicating their needs or wants to you. So let's take a moment and review some of these things and think about, how does your child indicate to you that they want to show you something? Do they use sounds, gestures? Do they reach and grab for you? Do they have a specific facial expression? Do they lead you by the hand? Do they use spoken words or phrases? Do they use any sign language? Or are they using any other forms of communication, such as picture exchange communication system or augmentative and alternative communication? Great, now let's go through the rest of this list, and think about, how does your child ask for attention, ask for an object or food that he or she likes, ask for a break when something is difficult, ask for help, explain pain or discomfort, express frustration, or to protest or say no to you. Great. Now that you've kind of reviewed some of these areas, it gives us a better sense of the strengths and some of the challenges your child would be having in communicating, and we can think about ways on how to increase your child's communication and provide more support for more appropriate ways of communication. So we know that children with developmental delays often have a lot of communication difficulties. And listed here in activity number 2, we have a list of common difficulties that children experience in communicating with others. So let's just review this list, and you can indicate in your book which of these communication difficulties your child is experiencing. For example, is there an absence of speech or other forms of communication? Do they have an atypical volume, such as their volume is always high or always very low, or they're singing, or they're very monotone? Do they have a sing-song rhythm in their spoken language? Do they communicate only to request what they need or want? Do they have difficulty initiating or sustaining a conversation with others? Do they have difficulties answering questions? Are they able to follow spoken directions without pointing or showing? Do they not know how to tell you not to do something? Do they know how to get your attention? Do they know how to ask for help? Do they have trouble sharing things of interest or bringing things to your attention? Do they not respond when their name is called? Do they understand the names of things and what others are saying? Do they use communication for socializing? Or do they have other forms of speech that may seem idiosyncratic, repetitive, or stereotyped? Or do they exhibit echolalia? So echolalia is when they repeat exactly what they hear back. So for example, if you were to say, "Do you want ice cream?" instead of responding saying yes or no, as what we would expect, a child with echolalia would respond, "Do you want ice cream?" because they're repeating exactly what they have heard. Great. On to the next stage of how can we really support our child's communication development. Well, first off, we need to remember that all of our children's behaviors are forms of communication. So everything that they do has a way of is intended to communicate something in some way. It may not be the way that we expect to see communication, but it is purposeful, and we need to treat that communication act as purposeful. We need to build on what they're currently doing or how they're currently attempting to communicate. And finally, we need to provide a verbal model, so providing an example for the child to follow. So we know that some children with developmental disabilities will tend to repeat exactly what they hear. So when we provide a verbal model, we want to state exactly what we want them to say. Something else that you may encounter with young children, especially if there's diverse languages being spoken in the home, is that you may hear from some professionals or even from some other parents that if your child has a developmental delay, that you should only speak one language to them, as speaking two languages may be very challenging. However, we know based on research and clinical experience that this is in fact not true. In fact, listed here are 5 main takeaways of the research on bilingual children and children who learn more than one language and who may or may not have developmental disabilities. First of all, we know that hearing two languages would not confuse children. We know that children as young as 9 months of age are able to accurately distinguish the sounds of two different languages. So children's brains are pretty powerful in that they're able to differentiate the sounds and do not get confused if they hear two different languages. Children can learn two languages, and in fact, you do not need to keep them separate for your child to learn both. For example, many parents adhere to a one parent, one language rule, where one parent will speak to a child in one language and the other parent will speak to the child in another language. This, in fact, is not necessarily critical for the child to learn both languages. So something else to keep in mind is that learning two languages may take longer than learning one language. Just as when we were in school, or when you're learning to do a new activity, if you're learning two things at the same time, it's going to take longer to master each one of those than if you were able to dedicate all of your time to just learn one activity or one subject. The same thing applies to languages. So when children are learning two languages, it may take longer for them to learn both languages because they're learning two different systems of languages. Something else to keep in mind is that children who are bilingual may have different strengths and weaknesses in each language. And finally, the most important statement or most important finding is that the quantity and quality of language that children hear is very important for their development of that language. So if a child never hears a language, there's minimal chance that they're actually going to learn it. Children also learn by hearing a broad variety of that language, not only simple language, but also more complex language. So if you really want your children to learn and master the two languages, it's important to make sure that they are exposed to it and that they're exposed to a broad variety of that language so that they're able to get that experience and learn from it. Great, so now we'll move forward and covers the main strategy for this session, which is modeling and expanding your language, your child's language. First, we want to make sure that we are giving meaning to the child's actions. This means that we interpret every sound, movement, gesture as an attempt of your child to communicate something to you or to someone else. So by giving meaning to your child's actions, you can describe what they're doing, commenting on the specific things they're doing so that they're able to start pairing the sounds that they're hearing of the words to their specific actions. You may need to adjust your language so that it is easier for your child to understand. So using simple language, single words, using gestures or visual cues such as pointing, speaking slowly, stressing important words, and being repetitive. This will help your child get more extensive experience in hearing the sounds, hearing the words that are associated with the activities they're doing and the toys they're playing with. And finally, to make sure that your child is interested, we should model language around the child's focus of interest. So talking about what your child is doing, what they're playing with, what they're eating, what they're looking at, you already have a captive audience. Your child is already captivated by what they're doing. So taking advantage of that opportunity to really model language and demonstrate what are the words that are associated with the task or the activity that the child is doing. So here are some examples of how you may model some language in terms of different activities your child might be doing. So for example, if your child is dropping blocks into a box, you can say block in, put the block in, put the blue block in. You'll also see that across all of these different activities, there's different levels of communication that you can model, from single word examples such as juice to more complex examples such as you are drinking apple juice. So we want to make sure that the language we're modeling is similar or close to the level or the communication stage that your child is currently in. Next, we want to make sure to expand on our child's language. So we know that our child's communication may be delayed in terms of what we would expect for their age. So that we want to make sure that we're providing them opportunities to expand on that language and communication. So things that you can expand can include nonverbal language, verbal language, and we want to be sure that we are using appropriate grammar and syntax so that when they're repeating things that they hear, they're repeating them correctly. And then just remember that your child may communicate in a number of ways. They can communicate in nonverbal ways, such as reaching, giving, showing, pointing, and pulling. And they can also communicate in verbal ways, such as sounds, single words, or two or more words. So for example, as I stated earlier, we want to make sure that we're modeling and expanding the language that is close to where our child's communication is. So for example, in this example here, this child is using single words to communicate. So then as a parent, we would be using two-word phrases to make sure that the child is able to just add one little word to expand their language. And slowly but surely we'll help them get to the further stages of communication development. So here are some examples of how we can expand language based on what the child is saying. So for example, if the child just says train, the parent can say push train, long train, blue train. So in these examples, we're just adding one word to help the child go from a single word communication to two-word phrases. If a child is using two-word phrases, we can add some adjectives, or we can even add a few more words to make the statement more grammatically correct. So the child says, push train. The parent then says, push the train fast. And as you can see, here are some additional examples of how we can expand on the child's communication and present a grammatically correct, appropriate sentence. So have you tried to expand on your child's communication? When you have expanded your child's communication, have you tried to provide examples closely aligned to where your child's communication stage is? When you expand on their language, do they repeat what you say? Do they start attempting to increase their communication? So if they're using one word, are they starting to try to use more than one word in their communication?